Hello, everybody. My name is Jamil Hassan. I am the host of this show. Welcome to Digital Dialogue. This episode, Making Sustainability Truly Sustainable. I have a wonderful show in order line up for you today, and it is really a culmination. It's a combination of the Institute for Digital Transformation and the Digital Economist, which I am an executive fellow, and my colleagues here today are also from the Digital Economist. It's the first combined show, and I look forward to bringing it to you. A little brief thing about me: I'm the host of the 𝗗𝗶𝗴𝗶 podcast. I'm also an author of a few hundred books, and I mostly focus on blockchain and crypto. But this episode is based on sustainability, and I have three amazing guests for you today. And in not any particular order, the first person I want to bring on board is Dr. Monica Lopez, and she can introduce herself. Monica, welcome.
Hello, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be here. So I'm also a senior executive fellow of the Digital Economist, but I'm also the co-founder and CEO of Cognitive Insights for Artificial Intelligence. And I essentially work around the area of AI and emerging technologies, risk management. So really looking forward to this dialogue that we're going to have.
Very cool. Me too. Awesome. So my next guest also is Dr. Melodina Stevens. Dr. Stevens, welcome.
Hello, thank you so much. So I'm the professor of innovation and technology governance. I work at the Mohammed bin Rashid School of Government in Dubai. I do a lot of work on frontier tech, especially AI and metaverse governance, and I am thrilled to be here. Hi, Monica, and hi, Jamil.
Hi. I'm glad. I'm honored you're here with us today. So awesome. So my next guest it will be. I didn't ask her. I know how to say her first name, but I don't know how to say her last name, so I'll try. 𝗗𝗶𝗴𝗶𝗶. Oceane,
Yes.
welcome.
Very good. Thank you. I'm French, so it's a French name. It's great to be here. Yeah, so my name is 𝗗𝗶𝗴𝗶𝗶, and I'm the founder of 𝗗𝗶𝗴𝗶𝗶, which helps to bring carbon credit projects and companies, help them to meet each other. So I'm basically a broker, and I'm a fellow at the Digital Economist and the Blockchain Work Group, and I focus on carbon credits and blockchain. And great to be here.
I'm happy you're here. I'm happy all three of you are here, and this is going to be great. So, going to get a first a little overview. What's people say sustainability. And there's been terms out there like what is sustainable, what is sustainability, what is greenwashing? Is it a corporate lip service, or is it really something? And the first thing I want to talk about is the economic, environmental, and social trade-offs. What companies gain, what they lose, what they sacrifice in the pursuit of sustainable goals and their missions. I'll throw it out there. And who would like to go first?
Oh, that's an interesting one.
Stephen?
Like a hot potato, right? Yeah. So when we talk about sustainability, and I'm going to take the broader perspective, sustainable development, right? So it's not just the planet. We're also talking social, about people and everything put together. This is something people care about because you see that in shareholder value. The moment companies say that they are sustainable, you see their share value go up. It is an important part of ESG ranking. But the problem is, are they doing it for the sake of the ranking and to pretend that they're doing it because they care? And if they cared, how would we know that? So a simple thing I'd give you an example is some of the most profitable companies right now are technology companies, if you look at the Fortune 500, but they have done some of the largest layoffs in the last 1 year. And that for me is something that's like greenwashing, right? You say you care about people, you're making a lot of money, but then you don't let them stay in your company. And these are people who have loans, maybe have other responsibilities. So for me, that doesn't work really very well. So I'm taking a social aspect. On a planetary aspect, we know that on one hand, the more we use technology, we also do a lot more harm to the environment. And we've seen quite a lot of reports on, like generative AI and water consumption or electricity consumption. So it looks great, but the figures that come out are productivity or profitability, but we don't really talk about the harm that we sometimes do on the other hand. So these are transparent dialogues that we want to have, and I'm so glad that you asked that question.
And, well, can I piggyback off of that and really, add, this whole aspect from the business perspective, where we certainly have. I mean, I completely agree with all the issues, the problems that Medina just mentioned, but these veritable set of challenges where you have the classic need from a company, again from the business perspective, of securing your business growth and your profits. But at the same time, we know that we need to address the long-term strategy that allows for us to be able to care for our employees, to care for our customers. And so I think really we're at this point where we're dealing with those issues, those problems, those needs, but also we have to realize that we all fit within a natural ecosystem. And so how do we actually balance that need for the care of the environment, but also to our employees, but then our customers?
Yeah, I love what you guys are saying, and I get very inspired by regenerative design and development, which again helps us to rethink how we think about sustainability, and we think a lot more about co-evolving with other living systems. So the human system and all that we are, but also evolving. And because I mean, systems are never stable, so co-evolving with other living systems. And I think this is where it requires a lot of. They actually, in regenerative systems, they have a much longer explanation, because you need to really change how you think about a lot of topics. That's why the explanation is not just in one sentence, but I think the answer is it's a lot of things, and you can't really answer it in just one sentence.
So would you say that, if anything, maybe perhaps we're talking about this issue of resiliency and agility? And I think that and I heard, Jamil, you were just about to say something, so maybe I'll let you go from there. But I just wanted to bring out those 2 points, that what does that mean in terms of actually putting action in?
No, it doesn't. What does it mean? Resiliency? Yeah. What does it mean? How do we get there?
Well, Osian?
Yeah, I would say that resilience is so important, and it's a great foundation. But resilience is sometimes, depending on how you approach it, but it can also be looking at only how to. It goes under the assumption that we're always under chaos and that we always have to react, right? And you're a little bit more in mitigation rather than really kind of at a even deeper level, trying to co-evolve with nature and having kind of incorporating more of the living systems.
So I just wanted to add something. I just have a new book that's come out that's called Anticipatory Governance. And you talked about reaction. We're saying, you need to see the future and shape the future. And that means we need business leaders who are looking 60 years in advance and seeing the impact of their decisions 60 years in advance, not just looking for the next quarter or the next 1 year, but long term, because what we do today will leave a lasting imprint on our children and our children's children. So we all have this mandate right now on the unborn and the voiceless, including the biodiversity of the planet. And this is huge. So it's really, really important. We have a whole of society and a whole of business attitude towards these problems, which are not just government problems. I think it's everyone that needs to get involved.
So I think you mentioned 60 years ahead. I would even argue that, because I know that there are certain value systems across different cultures that think even multiple generations, so up to 6, 7, 8 generations ahead. So I think there's a really fascinating question as to what does long-term sustainability really mean? But at the same time, let me sort of be that devil's advocate, where, again, from the business perspective, we're dealing with increasing geopolitical tensions that are happening, if not by the week, almost by the minute at this point, by the day. And so we have that to deal with. But then we have, our technological innovations of how we can use, for example, artificial intelligence, AI, to help with sustainability goals. And that's changing also by the minute. So how do we take that, but also acknowledge that we of course, we have the climate effects that we're seeing daily as well. So I almost want to throw out that question to each other here in terms of what does long-term thinking veritably mean in terms of a time frame?
I think you answered it well, because different cultures look at it differently. But I just want to give one example, right? So we talk about carbon credits, and this seems to be a very hot topic at WEF right now, that I'm doing good because I'm offsetting and I'm carbon neutral. So I just want to throw something out over there. In trees, if you plant a new tree, it probably only absorbs huge amounts of carbon after it matures 10 years down the line, right? If it doesn't do that before. So if you're planting new trees, it's not really contributing. And if a tree already exists, wasn't it doing its job already? So when you're saying you're offsetting and you're protecting a forest, the forest was also doing its job. So for me, it's a little bit confusing that sometimes we're throwing these words around and we're not really trying to deconstruct what it means. And that is important. And I want to highlight one point, because you mentioned, Monica. We're realizing right now that some of the ancestors had knowledge that actually can help us solve with some of the problems right now. Seagrass is actually a carbon sink, right? Mangroves are carbon sinks, and they help from tsunamis and climate change. But our ancestors knew that. So we need to go back and also, I think, in this long-term thing, understand our ancestors had wisdom. That doesn't mean we throw out the baby with the bathwater, kind of that issue, but we kind of acknowledge that all knowledge is important, and we need to go back and realize not everything is codified. So I want to put that out over there.
Yeah. So there's case studies. Right? Well, you mentioned three elements, right? You mentioned technology, business, and policy, right? Let's talk about business first, because it's probably maybe the easiest. I don't know. Are companies walking the talk, and how do you separate like commitments from spin? And what can companies do to pursue sustainability efforts?
I can go ahead and just sort of start with some some actual examples. So I'm thinking here in terms of first we have to say, companies are, at least those my clients I'm working with, are actually thinking about how do we harness data and technology? How do we actually use what we have, what we could have, what we need to collect to address this problem? So that's just sort of like at the larger general level. More specifically, what I am seeing is that a lot of strategists at this point are really putting their thinking hats on. They're really saying, how can we now use what we have with AI, with machine learning, with the fact that we have open source data coming from remote sensors, from satellites? How can we leverage all of that information to help us understand how we can actually support the cutting of emissions for ourselves and for other businesses and perhaps other clients that we work with? We also see that, for example, I know that energy providers that are using AI now to fine tune their wind farm operations. I know that others in the farming industry are now using AI to help them with understanding how to boost their energy efficiency when it comes to irrigation, when it comes to storage processes, and the whole process of harvesting their crops. And so, again, just little examples there, but I think that we almost need to really think about it in terms of a large ecosystem. So the providers, the supporters of that, the investors. That's another, I think, just one last example here. I am seeing investors really asking those questions to startups. How are you thinking about this question? How are you thinking? Who are your partners? How are they being sustainable? And so I'm seeing now a veritable interest in actually looking at the metrics, actually looking at the results, and actually saying how that can work as a collective.
Yeah, I would come back to Meladina's point on carbon credits. And it is important to get that corporate buyers get a little bit more educated and a little bit more sophisticated in the way that they kind of make their carbon credits portfolio. Because, for example, Meladina talked about how planting a tree will only absorb carbon for maybe around 100 years. So this may work if a corporate's emissions were only taking carbon that is equivalent to only 100 years. But for example, if you're looking at carbon that is from fossil fuels, it's carbon that's been stored for a millennia. So you want to be taking carbon credits that are also going to be storing carbon back at the equivalent timescale. So for example, potentially biochar, but also direct air capture, BECCS, and so on. An interesting case study, I think someone was asking, is that even though we want with carbon credits to have good kind of efficient carbon credits or efficient carbon absorption or carbon storage, you also want to make sure that the project itself has, where it's located, it incorporates correctly the different stakeholders. So I'm working with a project, for example, in India. And for example, a great way that you can get SDG co-benefits, extra co-benefits, is by saying that you want more women into the project. But this is a biochar project where you have to burn biomass, and it can be a little bit, actually a lot of women in India don't want to do this job. So it's more about incorporating these ladies or these women into different ways into the project. So for example, helping them make something called 𝗗𝗶𝗴𝗶𝗶, which helps to fortify the biochar. So there's a lot of time that needs to be taken into these projects so that you're making sure that each stakeholder is listened to and you're meeting their needs.
I'd just like to add a point to Pooja. So I think the important thing is there is no one solution that will be perfect long-term. And I think that's what Monica was mentioning about agility. You need to be able to challenge your assumptions. So we know at the beginning, people were like, oh, let's do the bath beads with plastics. And now we realize there's microplastics everywhere, right? So there's a pivot around that. We've moved away from plastics, but somehow the new so-called biodegradable plastics also have their challenges. So I think it's always this thing where we have to constantly learn, and we've got to realize that every decision we make has trade-offs, including something I'll just give you as an example, electronic vehicles. EV batteries are the most difficult to recycle, and they're very, very toxic to the environment, far more than fossil fuels, as an example. So if you've adopted EV cars, but you do not have a policy for EV battery recycling, this is a challenge. Same thing with solar cells. So we should not make decisions based on short term. We've really got to ask those questions. My renewable energy source is wind. Where are the propellers going? Because propellers aren't easily biodegradable. How are they being disposed? If we don't have that kind of knowledge, then we will make short-term decisions, and 60 years later or 100 years later, we'll have another problem that we have to face.
Yeah. About the long, I gotta admit, I don't admit, but Donald Trump recently said we're getting out of the U.S. is getting out of the Paris Climate Accord, and growing up as a Gen Xer, I was told the whole climate thing is a hoax, but it's not. We rarely ever consider the long-term impacts, and when people get into office, like they have a 4-year horizon instead of a 60-year horizon. You mentioned a 60-year horizon. So I wanted to find out, how governments and regulators can have this long-term view and how they may be able to, help or hinder, sustainability efforts from a policy perspective, and how they can take on that view for the long term.
So maybe I can start answering that question, but also in part because I want to piggyback off of what Melodina was mentioning, which is, she was talking about the need for really this knowledge that we require, and explaining further this concept of agility. And absolutely, yes, I agree with that. And at the same time, to answer Jamil's point here, I think this really shows the importance of data. Of science, of empirical work, because a lot of this has to, and that takes time to acquire. So there need to be part of a policy efforts need to be not only mentioning that we want to put out statements on inclusiveness and sustainability of AI, for example, for people and the planet. And I am directly referring to the one that was just recently put out from the AI Action Summit in Paris, France. And so, that's good to do. But at the same time, what it means is that we need to be investing far more into the science of all of this, the actual empirical work that needs to be done so that we can be acquiring that data and then immediately utilizing that to inform policy changes. From continuing from that point about plastics, I mean, that takes time to understand, right? Because initially it was invented to provide a good function. And then it took time to realize on the problems that result from that. And that's only one little example from many that one could talk about. And so I think really it shows to the power of not only how we can leverage data for AI uses, but really data for understanding these new technologies that we are coming up with and the immediate effects they're having. And then also creating almost like smaller types of experimental ecosystems where we can also, in fact, use artificial intelligence to create future scenarios. So we can actually create those 60, 100 more years ahead within science to actually then integrate that. I think I would argue for policy directives.
Could I add another take to it? So I think the governments and those businesses that will succeed are those, and Ocean mentioned mindset. I want to highlight this, are those with diversity of viewpoints, right? If you cannot accept another person's viewpoint, you are never going to succeed. And I think this is so important in today's age and time. No one government, no one company will have all the answers. And I think it is really, really important that you allow those diverse viewpoints to come in and you have those dialogues or discussions and try and understand how the science fits in. Why is it important? Maybe culturally in one country, they don't have jobs. So do you need AI at this point? Are there more basic needs to go and fulfill? So you need to have those discussions. Are we, by using AI, which is an algorithmically derived tool, removing cultural nuances, linguistic nuances, things that may be important? So we need to have these conversations, and policymakers and those decision makers of large companies that can impact huge populations should be very mindful of their responsibility. It's not an easy responsibility, but in the future, people will judge us by what we do today. And I think the weight, the mantle of the responsibility we bear right now is heavy for each one of us.
And this is on top of issues, right? In terms of, we don't want to also paint a rosy picture. We are seeing a lot of big banks and companies who have cut budgets for their sustainability groups, and the research side of it as well. So, science experts within that have been brought in precisely to address these issues. And so, that was also an answer to an earlier question that came up in terms of our businesses actively, truly addressing this. And apology, Ocean, I saw that you were about to mention something.
Yeah, I was going to piggyback off of Meladina. There's this project in the Netherlands called the 𝗗𝗶𝗴𝗶𝗶. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but it was a carbon capture and storage project that essentially failed. It was between Shell and the Dutch government, and the main reason that it failed is because there was local opposition for it. They were scared that there might be explosions, or there was some misinformation, and then even some local governments that also opposed it. But I think their main mistake was that they didn't come and actually talk to the people that would be kind of locally around the project. And that's why they opposed. I think if right from the start they had included them and listened to their needs much more, I think they would have been much more accepting of the project, which would have stored or which would have captured carbon. So it's this. I think one of the questions that Jamil asked at the beginning was, what are the trade-offs? Well, one of the trade-offs is that you have to put in the effort to go and talk to people that are going to be directly affected by the actions of a business or of a project, even a sustainable project. So we're not in a simple world, but we have to make with it, and that includes being particularly engaged. And I think as well, can't remember. I think both Meladina and Monica talked about how we won't have one answer, or we won't have one kind of perfect solution, or whether it be plastic or something else, because we're constantly evolving. And this is the mindset that we need to just accept. It's a fact. So yeah.
Well, being from the blockchain and crypto side since 2017, you hear a lot of stories. People say Bitcoin is bad, but it's not. So they say it's bad for the environment. It's not. Not all blockchains are bad for the environment. Not AI is bad for people. So, and there's lots of other technological advancements, right? So how do innovations, in resource management, in supply chain, in data, how can they help refine what's possible, and then how do we get people on board, say, hey, this is what's possible, and help and join in and make those good decisions?
I think we have two parts, is blockchain bad? And then how do we make, Ocean, did you want to go first? Okay, so with anything that we use, and we're going to look at technology as a tool, right? And the question, if you look at the definition of technology, I just did this class with my students this week, and the definition of technology is something for the benefit of man. It's very, very simple, right? And I think that's the whole thing. As long as it benefits the human being, it's good. The moment we're doing technology for the sake of technology, we have a problem in that. And that's where you see sometimes there is these challenges. So why am I using blockchain? It's maybe because I want traceability of my supply chain. So I want to make better informed decisions. I want to help people. So the moment I'm not helping people and I decide to use that technology to penalize them, I think then we've lost the purpose or the plot. So it's just really understanding why. And I think this is the reason why we end up in greenwashing. Companies sometimes lose their purpose and their values. They forget why they started something. A great example, OpenAI, right? That is now in its third iteration, I think. So you start off with one purpose, and somewhere along the line, because of market demands or shareholder demands or investor demands, you drift away, you have mission drift, and this becomes a big challenge. And in this kind of situation, you require, a steadfast commitment to your goals. And Pooja asked that question as an example. I like Patagonia. They decided to remain small. And I think that's very unusual. And they stayed small because they wanted to be true to their purpose. You don't always have to be a $1 trillion company, $1 million company. I see a lot of companies in Germany, for example, who decide to be small because they say, I have 100 families I need to look after and I'm doing it well. Why do I need to go on the stock market and become mega? But that's not the kind of media hype that we have right now. The kind of perspective we have is you need to go and list, you need to become $1 billion unicorn and things like that. So maybe we need some changes in the way media also looks at companies, and maybe it's okay to be small as long as you want to be true to your purpose. And that's perhaps something we need to think about in the future too.
I might also add on the blockchain perspective that there's not one kind of blockchain solution for all carbon credits. Firstly, because different carbon credits have different funding needs. So for example, some projects may require cash much more regularly. And some projects may it's okay to be much more patient and to then be able to have, for example, the full price directly from the corporate buyer. But some carbon projects that need cash faster, they might be willing to give off kind of a bigger margin and then kind of use traders as well to get in cash earlier. So then there are different carbon credit mechanisms, different blockchain mechanisms that can be used and that can be used per project as well. And then it's obviously possible that some projects also don't require blockchain at all. So it's great to be very much more specific project to project and to their needs. You can also use, for example, a stable coin where you where you lock up some carbon credits, and then you can buy this stable coin, and then you're helping to fund the project. You can also have models where you're just tokenizing the carbon credit at the end. And then you're also, for example, showing within each carbon credit, making sure that a certain stakeholder is being paid the right amount, or is, for example, directly paid. There's just really a panoply of different possibilities, and it's good to stay educated, whether it's project developers or corporate buyers, to kind of their needs, both of their needs.
Well, and I would add, from that I think here what we're saying is that there's a mention of a need for veritable change in mindset, but ultimately that means that we need a change in frameworks. But then that also means that we need a change in the benchmarks that we use to test performance. And then on top of that, we need all the different types of metrics. And so the problem I see here, and one that I almost want to put back as a question to the group, is, how do we then come to agree on that? How do we then align with that? Because again, as we've already mentioned, the many problems that exist and the risks that are happening daily at this point. And so how can we ensure that, not just those of us here who are conversing about this and those of our listeners who are there, how can we make sure that this exits forward and actually leads to the change that we're talking about? And maybe it means it has to happen at the grassroots level. It has to happen at the small and medium enterprise level. And so, I throw back the question there: how can we get to this agreement of alignment around and values? I think, Melodina, you really mentioned that point there, the need for the importance of values, returning to a mission and having a set of values and those that we can be in agreement with.
So I just want to highlight, we have 17 SDGs and 169 indicators, which we have to achieve by 2030, which I don't think we're achieving. But the important thing is, even if I look at the SDGs, there's lots of things missing, right? And I think this is where, again, businesses need to use their own common sense and say, okay, that's great. These are SDGs set by the United Nations. Maybe there's something else that you want to achieve that's not necessarily on the indicator that is important for your community. And I would look at community first, starting with your employees, and then with your suppliers and distributors and the place that you're based, and then your market, right? And shareholders, I would put last, actually, as a community. Though you have a fiscal responsibility, yes, to them, but not more than that, right? So I think you have to look at it as layers. And it was interesting. I was reading a blog today, and they asked, can AI help us achieve SDGs, or are SDGs the way that we need to achieve AI? And I thought that was really fascinating, because if you inverted it, it also made sense that I want to achieve all these SDGs: zero poverty, I want to be good to the environment, I want inclusiveness, I want responsibility, and then I build my AI. Or is it AI to achieve SDGs? And I think sometimes we're just doing the technology and we're putting that everywhere. And someone was saying it's the age of AI. I just have to say my startup and AI, and I get, like this much of investment, because it's like I think this year it'll be agentic AI, but yeah. So again, Monica mentioned education. I think Ocean mentioned that we need to very quickly have some literacy on what these terms mean. I know they're thrown around quite a lot in the media, and people just assume they know what quantum is, what blockchain is, what AI is. And we have fundamental differences on what they actually mean, what they can do, and what they should not do. And this is something yes, I think Marissa absolutely right. We need better questions to be asked to all stakeholders for this.
What would be some better questions we could ask?
That's a good question. Why am I using this? How will it help me achieve my purpose? And then how do I monetize? Because that's why you're doing a purpose, and therefore you have a monetization plan. You have a business model based on that. So most companies, when they set up, and you speak to most founders, they start up with a purpose, right? and then their business model is built around that. Sometimes it becomes all about the business model. And I think that's where we really need to have those challenging questions. In the short term, I understand you have to sometimes choose the profits for survival. That is the mandate of no business can survive without the revenues and the profits. So that's understandable, right? But in the long term, if you keep choosing the profits or the revenues and you discard the purpose again and again and again, it neither benefits the company long term, nor does it benefit the environment or the people. So it becomes very toxic. So I think this is where I hope investors will ask better questions. I hope the banks and the fund managers who are putting money into businesses ask better questions. And I hope governments come up with better policies. I wouldn't say to punish, that doesn't seem to work, but to reward those companies that are doing well. So maybe we need to flip the way we do regulations and reward companies that do really well rather than punish them, because the stick method doesn't seem to be working. They find ways to bypass that. And instead, they spend a lot of money hiring lawyers, which is not exactly where the money should be going. It should be going into purpose. So again, another point of view, but...
Yeah, but you're highlighting that, that Jamil asked, what is the question we should ask? And I think here you're highlighting, what are the types of incentives, the new types, the transformative incentives that we need to now come up with that ensure that even if you're not making the expected profit, or you're doing giving the investor their return of investment, the expected return of investment by X time frame, there's still something else. And that else, whatever that else is where the value is, that is not going to be directly correlated with monetary gain.
Maybe one question that I think I try to ask myself, and I think everyone can ask themselves, is how do human systems co-evolve with other living systems? And that means, evolving means includes monetary value and financial incentives, but not only, right? And I think sometimes we think about nature and other living systems as things just that we either have to, what can we take from them and what can benefit us? Or then maybe the step above is how can we protect them? But I think the step above is how do we evolve with them? How do we benefit them, and how do they benefit us in a much more co-evolutionary relationship where, and this requires a different type of thinking, a little bit more time, but I think it's completely possible. It just requires this intention.
There was a question that just came in, and I had before this show today, I had a podcast where my guest and I spoke about the prisoner's dilemma, which is an either or view, and how we need to break that down and create collaboratively from the ground up. So the question came in was, what are the adverse effects of AI on SDGs? How can we overcome them, or how can we, make them, flip them to be positive? So I'll put that out there.
I can start with an idea there, in which we all know by now that increased computing power, or we call compute, has really been a key enabler of our current wave of large language models and generative AI at large. And so certainly as more compute is applied, we know that the general performance of predictability improves. And so an answer here is that we already know that governments are investing heavily in domestic production of compute and in the subsidized compute access to those that are outside of big tech companies. And so I know there was a recent fantastic paper that came out not too long ago, research paper on policy, as to let's look at how compute can be used as a governance mechanism, in part because we know that compute has very specific properties of being detectable in regards to excludability, how you can quantify it, and how it relates to supply chain. concentration. And so because of those very specific factors, properties of compute, we can come up with governance mechanisms in place that allows for particular policies to require, let's say, visibility around that, allocation, enforcement. And so that could be one way in which we take this very issue that has become a problem, but sort of turn it on its head and say, okay, well, let's utilize it to see, who are the individuals who are having such a big carbon footprint for use of these systems, and let's actually enforce. Let's come up with mechanisms which we can enforce their use of it.
So I was looking at the question Pooja had, which was on AI and SDGs, right? So I see one impact that's happening, and I think it will be on employment. And we're not really sure how to solve it. We all say retraining or reskilling is the way to go, but no one's really clear who bears the cost of retraining or reskilling. And for me, that's a problem, right? So is it the company that does that? Is it the individual themselves that has to do that? Or is it the government? But what gets left back behind, and I want to highlight this, is we lose knowledge. We know a lot of knowledge is in people's heads. And when you get people when you retrench them or you fire them, they're going to take their knowledge with them. And you don't know when you need that knowledge. And that is going to be a challenge. And knowledge can become obsolete if it's not regularly renewed or used. So for me, this becomes an interesting dilemma right now, is in the future, the way that we're going. And we already see with synthetic data, because a lot of people are using AI to create data, right? So if you're using ChatGPT to come up with your business plan or with some of your writing, that is synthetic data. So the system is getting fed synthetic data. And that means it doesn't have perhaps the same quality of the data it was fed before, when it was scraping off actually people's own inputs in. So in the simulations that they've done with synthetic data, systems start failing the more synthetic data you put in. I think this will be in the next 20, 30 years, we will see some interesting developments. I do know companies with LLMs are chasing after now other language data. So they're chasing Africa and Latin America and trying to get the data translated, because this will be new knowledge in. But even that will dry up at some time. And something like a quantum computer is a monster that needs to constantly be fed. So the question is, do we have enough data to feed these monsters? I think the answer will be no. So the only way you can do it is synthetic data.
Yeah, I would start with a pretty sad view, maybe, for AI, which is that I think the EU Commission has asked all of its members to make a research to research over next year what is the foreign direct investment of these countries. Of AI in countries outside of the EU. So it's a pretty big effort. So they're giving them a year, but the idea is that they're scared that AI is going to be weaponized, and they want to make sure that it's within kind of that AI is kept within national interests. So this, I mean, if AI is weaponized, this is, I think, a crime against all SDGs. However, I would say that AI can also be used, and this was kind of written in the WEF Global Risks report, that if AI isn't used with SDGs in mind, it will be worse in the next 10 years. But if they're used with SDGs, they can help a lot with reductions. And that's one of the main elements that we need to be focusing on. If you only look at climate change, sustainability is much more, but just within climate change, reductions is a huge area that we should be focusing on. So there is still some good and some bad.
Interesting. So I want to ask about takeaways, right? In order to make sustainability truly sustainable, what are the key takeaways you would like this audience to consider, to take upon for themselves going forward?
So if we want to make it sustainable, I think it needs to have human and planet flourishing. So it's not enough just to sustain human beings and sustain the planet. They both need to flourish. And this is what should drive you, right? So whatever you do, is the human being flourishing? Is the planet flourishing? And if you can say yes to both, I think you're truly sustainable. If you've got any doubt in any one of those things, you need to do some deep soul searching, right? And I think that's my main takeaway. I just want to highlight this. A technology like AI can do so much good. So I know we spoke about like negative scenarios, but it can do so much good. But we need to be clear, it needs to do good for people and for the planet.
Well, and I would add to that, so I absolutely agree that we are completely interdependent in our existence and the planet's existence. But what that highlights is that we need to understand what the data is. I mean, I think really fundamentally, we know that data is what feeds these systems. And, you mentioned that at Ocean as well. And so that's critical. We need to know what that data is, who is collecting it, why it's being collected, all its various meanings. And I think in that sort of soul searching, it also has to be done with what information entails, because then that is going to be what allows us to say, okay, we have supporting evidence, or we have the data to show us that we are having an impact or not. And if we don't have that clear, our impacts are not going to be clear, and then they are going to get greenwashed and they are going to get misinterpreted. And so, and I think there was a question earlier in terms of the problem of misinformation. And so again, if it goes back to the data, we don't understand, we don't have clarity and transparency around that, then that is just going to have a domino effect forward in a negative way.
Those are good key takeaways for myself. And what I would add is to look very much at a local level. I think it's good to have a global view, of course, and we have to collaborate at a global scale. But when you're in project development, you have to have a much bigger local view, and that means including all of the living systems within that local system. So I think this also looks into making sure that you're relying on data and that you're looking at as well people and planet. I think so.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank Ocean, Dr. Monica, Dr. Meladina. Thank you very much for speaking with me today. This has been a joint collaboration between the Institute for Digital Transformation and the Digital Economist. We can be located at thedigital-economist.com. It's been a wonderful conversation. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining Digital Dialogue. Look for more episodes at noon Eastern Time on most Tuesdays of every month. Can't join the live session? You can watch the replay anytime on our YouTube channel.